So you've laid your quilt up and you've quilted it, and what I wanted to show you now is an alternative way to put your binding on with Mitre Corners. So I'm going to take it over to here. I've cut the strips at 2 1/4 inches wide. Now it's important to note that the strips do not have to be cut on the bias because we're not going around a curvy edge. What I have done here is I've cut a 45-degree angle on the short edge of the binding, and I've folded it over and pressed it in half to give me a neat edge, and then pressed the binding with the wrong sides together. What I want to do is I actually want to start quilting but leave myself a tail, and all will become clear when we finish. So I've started quilting here, and just to keep these in position I'll just pop a couple of quilt clips there, and we're now going to take it to the sewing machine. To achieve nice mitered corners, it's important to stop sewing 1/4 inch before each side. The easiest way to do that is to get yourself a ruler, and I like to double up on this. I'll mark it with a dot so you can see I've clearly marked it there, and then I've popped a pin in. Now the head of the pin is in this direction, and I do have the pin hanging over. Don't worry, I'm not going to sew over that pin, I'm just going to sew up to it. I've now popped the quilt, the binding and the quilt into the sewing machine. I'm using a walking foot on this occasion, and I've increased the stitch length up to 3. And all I'm going to do is sew the binding on through all of the layers up to that point. Stop every now and again just to check everything is right. Now this is where this pin sticking out is really important. So we're going to take it nice and slowly. If you're not confident as you get really close, you can always use the hand wheel of your machine to turn it. We'll just take it right up to that pin. And I don't want to go over the pin, but I don't want to sew short of the pin. Once I've got to the pin, if you want to, you can remove the pin there and do some reverse stitches, 3 or 4 reverse stitches, and then you are going to remove the whole quilt out of the machine. So I've removed the binding from the machine, and I'm now lying the quilt with the binding that I've just sewn in front of me running horizontal. To get the mitered corner, what I'm going to do is flip the binding up north, so it goes up, and then we're going to flip it back down on itself. So I'll do that again. You have the binding there, flip it north, crease it, and believe it or not, my binding's just landed where I've got a seam, so I've got a little bit of extra fabric there, but hey ho, we'll work with it. And then you're going to bring it down so it's lying nice and flat, and this top edge is now lying, if I just bring it round here, so it's all nice and neat, excuse those threads there, and I'll just grab a quilt clip to put it into position. We're now going to put it back into the machine, and we're going to start sewing from the very top, not from here but from the very top of the binding. So the binding is now back in the machine. I've removed the quilt clip, and I'm going to stitch down, and each time just checking that the raw edges of the binding and the raw edges of the quilt are all coming together. And I'm actually approaching, I've done 3 sides already on this quilt, and I'm approaching this tail that we had earlier on. So I want to sew to about there, and then I'll remove the binding and the quilt from the machine once again. So once I've got to here, I'm just going to do a couple of reverse stitches and then remove the quilt from the machine. We're now going to turn the quilt around. And as you can see, I have a longer piece of binding here, and I have, you remember where I had the tail, and I just clipped that into position. Now the reason that you need this tail is we're effectively going to slot this binding inside this other binding, and it just gives you a really neat edge. Work out how much you want, and then with your scissors you just snip it off. So I'm going to snip it there, Be generous rather than under generous at this point, because it's nothing worse if you cut it too short. You're then going to flip that open this part of the binding, this is the starting point, and just pop that in and match all of the raw edges to the edge of your quilt. Once you've done that and you're happy, and you've got that nice and smooth, then fold that one back over and clip everything into position. And at this point you can check that all the raw edges are lying nice and flat. I'm just going to pop another couple of pieces in there, because as this sews along, just make sure you're not going to get any rucks at that point. And want to make sure as well that you're not going to get flip it open. Sometimes it can flip, is this part here. So I'm just going to put a clip in, because we can always remove the clips. And where you've got that little triangle, if you want to at this stage, you can easily just snip that off, or you could snip it off after you've sewn. We're now going to pop the whole quilt back under the sewing machine. If you hear a noise, it's because the quilt clips are banging off the extension table. Now, another tip that I'll give you is, if you have an extension table for your machine, please pop it on, because it helps with the weight of your quilt. So I'm just going to start sewing again, just removing the quilt clips as I go. Take your time, leave the needle in that down position, and sew right up to the part where it's joined. And I can use my fingers. And when we come to the bit where the 45-degree angle is, that's the top one. Let's carry on sewing. Nearly there. Take that last one out. And then you're going to sew right up to the beginning of your stitching when we first started to put the binding on. Cut your threads. Raise your presser foot. And now you've got a lovely 45-degree angle on the front of your binding. So to finish off, if you have a lot of bulk in the corner, you can remove it, but with a mitered corner, I tend to leave my corners in position because it adds a little bit of structure to the mitered corner. So simply fold your raw edges, or your folded edges I should say, over to cover the stitching of the binding. And then when you get to the corner, literally just create that 45-degree angle on the back, and you'll see it gives you a lovely angle on the front. Clip it all the way around, and I personally prefer to hand stitch my bindings down. As you can see, Vlieseline has a wide range of products, each with different properties and benefits for your projects. You can view the whole range on the Vlieseline website, where you can download the brochure, which has detailed information on all of the products across our 4 categories. You can also join the conversation with us on our Facebook page, Creative Community Group and Instagram. All of the details are below.